Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce Professor at the University of Dallas and also my father, Matthew Walz. Uh, Matthew Walz was born in New York, but grew up mostly in Ohio. He completed undergraduate studies at Christendom College in Virginia, where he double majored in philosophy and theology, and graduated as the valedictorian of the class of 1995. He did further graduate studies in the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America, and he earned a doctorate in philosophy by completing a dissertation on Thomas Aquinas' understanding of free will. Matthew has been teaching at the college level since 1998. As a graduate student, he taught for 2 years at the Catholic University of America, then began teaching at Thomas Aquinas College, where he remained for 8 years. Since 2008, he has served as a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Dallas, as well as being the director of intellectual formation at Holy Trinity Seminary. His research and writing focus primarily on medieval philosophy, ancient philosophy, and philosophical anthropology. Matthew has been married since 1999 to his lovely wife, Teresa, my mother, and thus far they've been blessed with 8 children, 2 boys and 6 girls, who keep them busy, of course, as I can attest, but also joyful and grateful to God for his multitudinous gifts. Please welcome Dr. Matthew Walz.
Thank you, Nicholas. Very much appreciate your being here early in the morning and introducing me. Also, a quick thanks to Walter, Andrea, and Paula for all they do to bring this community of homeschoolers together through Homeschool Connections, and in particular for giving me the opportunity to present today during this wonderful conference about life after high school. And I do, as my son Nicholas just said, I work at the University of Dallas, and so I do this presentation as a representative of that wonderful university. I don't doubt that many of us, in fact, likely each and every one of us, has experienced moments in life for which we just weren't ready. I know I've experienced such moments, plenty of them. In fact, I'm hoping this talk is not one of them. There's almost no worse feeling in the world when we seem enveloped by embarrassment and shame. Perhaps it was a piano recital for which we did not prepare sufficiently, or a penalty kick in a soccer game that you didn't practice enough, or a speech you had to give and yet your nerves overtook you, or a final exam for which you failed to study well enough, or an interview for a job that you bombed, and so on and so forth. At such moments, we realize quite clearly that we have failed to live up to certain expectations that we set for ourselves, or perhaps expectations that we think others have of us. Moreover, it becomes evident at precisely such a moment that there's nothing to be done about it, because the time for preparation has ended and the time to perform has arrived. The moment is now, right now, and we're just not ready for it. Now, thank God, life is not filled only with those sorts of moments. I imagine that would be an unbearable life. Thank God there are also moments of timely achievement, moments when you or I or someone else really lives up to the moment, moments when we or someone else does just the right thing at just the right time and in just the right way. We love these moments. We crave these moments. These are the beautiful moments, the clutch moments of life. We see these moments in sports when the pressure of a tense situation somehow elevates a player to a higher level, especially during crunch time. We see such moments in the arts, when during a national dance competition or a musical performance in a major venue, the dancer or the musician performs better than ever before, doing his or her personal best. These highlight moments manifest human greatness. They are the stuff of highlight reels. They live on in our memories as examples that continue to inspire us. Perhaps, though, we should not be thinking so big, because we see the sort of dynamic at work in everyday moments as well, when we say just the right word at just the right time, and it makes a key difference in the life of someone. Perhaps, in fact, because we thought about it ahead of time or prayed about it. Or we ace a quiz or a test because we took extra time to read and study for it the night before. Or our team wins an important game on a Saturday because our practices that week were especially focused and intense. Experiencing such moments helps us to realize that achievement does not come out of nowhere. No, these more usual moments of achievement, these smaller victories, arise from the coming together, from a kind of marriage between our own preparation and readiness on the one hand, and on the other hand, some fitting set of circumstances for which we were not fully responsible. By experiencing these smaller victories, we begin to see that those great and inspiring moments of success, those beautiful highlight moments that we love to watch or to recall, they too do not come out of nowhere. They too arise when human preparation and readiness meets a fitting set of circumstances within which the human greatness can shine forth. Recognizing this dynamic in life is at the basis of what I'd like to say today. Human greatness reveals itself at the meeting point between a person's readiness on the one hand and a fitting set of circumstances on the other. In addition, I want us to consider this dynamic not only through the eyes of reason, but also through the eyes of faith. Reason can recognize this dynamic, that human readiness comes together with fitting circumstances in beautiful ways that manifest human greatness. But through the eyes of faith, we see something deeper and more beautiful at work. Because one who believes in God does not take those fitting set of circumstances for granted. Not at all. Those circumstances are not mere chance, nor are they purely accidental. No, they are subtle reminders of God's presence. They are reminders of the gentle but firm divine hand within which God holds all of reality and nudges it toward the fulfillment of his providence. As we think together in this conference about life after high school, and more specifically about going to college, I think it's important that you keep in mind the way in which reason and faith can come together to reveal this dynamic, that the measure of greatness that we achieve is the fruit of this marriage between the readiness that we bring to the table and the providential plan that God has for us and for all of creation. Within this marriage, of course, it's clear that our role lies primarily on the side of human readiness, though it is a readiness that needs to be encompassed by our faith in providence. It's important then that you who are going on to college do so with a view to arriving at such readiness, to achieving a wide-ranging and holistic readiness that enables you to achieve greatness when God's providential hand touches your life. I, for one, am convinced that a tried and true way to achieve such holistic readiness is by means of liberal education. Liberal education understood in a holistic manner that addresses the human person in all of his or her dimensions. Allow me to unfold this a bit more as I share my PowerPoint with you. I hope at this point you have a better sense of the meaning of my title and how I'm suggesting that you might approach decision-making about life after high school. Indeed, perhaps some of you will recognize the quotation that is a part of my title. The readiness is all. The quote comes from the Bard, William Shakespeare. It is from his great play Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 2. When I was thinking about this presentation and what to say to you today, for some reason this scene entered my mind. Was it Providence? I don't know. Partly I think it was. At any rate, I want us to consider what Hamlet says to Horatio in this scene, in this key moment in which Hamlet is on the brink of making decisions, heavy decisions. Now, I should say that I'm not presenting Hamlet necessarily as a moral exemplar. We could argue about that some other time. But his words here are really powerful, because Horatio in some ways is trying to get him to maybe shy away from taking the moment that's going to come. Horatio says, if your mind dislike anything, obey it. I will forestall their repair hither and say you are not fit. So Horatio seems to counsel a kind of avoidance of the situation where Hamlet's project, as it were, in the play is to come to a climax. What does Hamlet say to this? Not a whit. We defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man has aught of what he leaves, what is it to leave betimes? Now, I don't want to do an exegesis of this scene exactly, because it would take me a lot longer than the half hour that's been allotted to me. But interestingly, I want to just call attention to a couple of things that Hamlet says that maybe prepare us for thinking about this dynamic that I would like to get across today. Hamlet's rejection of augury, superstition, right? That is opposed to the acceptance of providence. Because providence is a meeting place between the divine and the human, whereas augury or superstition or living according to omens is a kind of crapshoot where reason and divine providence don't really meet, but there's a kind of acceptance of an arbitrariness in the world. And Hamlet knows in what he says here that one way or another, you are meeting divine providence. And what falls on you, of course, as he says, is readiness. Are you ready for the moment? Because the readiness is all. So I want us to think about this notion of readiness, to think about how do we ready ourselves for our lives and for our vocations? Because both are at work in our thinking about college and our thinking what to do in life after high school. And what I'd like to lay out here for you is a kind of framework to think about readiness. What I would say 4 aspects of readiness that can be achieved by means of a holistic liberal education. In other words, a liberal education that takes place within a residential community that's rooted in faith. So it's not simply the engagement with the intellect as such, although that proves to be very crucial, as I would like to show, but also an engagement with our hearts, with our souls, with our bodies even. So it's a liberal education that takes place within a residential community rooted in faith. And what I'd like to lay out here are the dimensions that enter into readying you for life as a whole. At the root of that readiness is what I would call moral readiness. Our readiness simply as human beings who need to live a life that's rational and ordered. And this moral readiness consists, it seems to me, most fundamentally in 2 dimensions or 2 realities. First of all, an adequate self-awareness of our strengths, weaknesses, and convictions. You might say, an awareness of our conscience, right? To have an authentic experience of our own conscience and what we hold and believe. And that has to be supplemented, or what has to build on that sense of conscience is the virtues, right? In particular, we think of the moral virtues of moderation, courage, justice, prudence, and all the smaller virtues that enter into the development and supplementation of our consciences that direct us to what is right and keep us from what is wrong. This lays a foundation upon which everything else must build. And so the community to which you enter, it's important to consider how that community will be readying you morally in order to make decisions about your life and your vocation. And this needs to be supplemented, or complemented, I should say, from above, you might say, by a spiritual readiness. This readiness, too, has a sort of foundational dimension that gets built on regular liturgical and sacramental practices. Are we actually a religious person, right? Do we have a foundation of religion that gets perfected and completed by growth in faith, hope, and charity by a personal life of prayer? And that spiritual readiness comes into combination with our moral readiness so as to integrate us as both, you might say, human beings well formed who are also open to God, fundamentally in a relationship with God, both in the community of the church as well as in a personal way through prayer and other means of communication with God. Now, this integrated self, this spiritually ready and morally ready person, is oriented ultimately towards serving the common good, serving the communities to which one belongs. First and foremost, I would say, I'm thinking of the natural communities to which we belong, the various human communities to which we belong, our families, our local places where we live, our states, our nations, so political communities, and all other sorts of organizations or communities to which we might belong. But that readiness to serve on a human level in some ways serves an even deeper purpose, namely our openness to vocation, our openness to God's call to a state of life in the church, whether it be marriage or priesthood or religious life or some other particular vocation to which we feel God is directly calling us. Now, you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with liberal education? Well, partly it has to do with the community within which everything I've been talking about so far has more to do perhaps with the community to which that liberal education belongs. What is the context within which it takes place? But this has to be, you might say, finalized or brought to fulfillment in particular through the formation of your intellect, so that your intellectual readiness can allow you to both understand these other dimensions of your readiness and make them more and more fully your own. And it seems to me that a liberal education does this in an inimitable way. How does it do it? It does it first of all through what I'm calling here ample practice in the liberal arts and a sufficient general education. In other words, the development in yourself of a kind of cultivated soul, a soul that belongs to a long tradition of learning, that involves in you all the disciplines, literature, philosophy, theology, the sciences, politics, economics, psychology, all of these disciplines coming together so that you have a kind of general education that allows you to be a presence in the world who understands our place in history, our place within politics, our place within the world as a whole. But this has to be completed, I would argue, by developing a mastery of a subject matter. This is, in many colleges, why majors are so important, that you have to have the experience of digging down towards truth so that you can experience what it means to know, what it means really to know something, and what it means to be wise within a certain subject matter. Because that experience of wisdom, that experience of true knowledge, provides a solid foundation of both self-confidence in your ability to know, and also the kind of conviction that will allow you to love and attach yourself to the truth in a manner that will feed all your other dimensions of your readiness, right? If you are convinced of the truth of what it means to be a good human being, this solidifies and congeals your moral readiness. If you have learned about God, if you have learned what we can know about God through reason and what we can accept about God through faith, then your spiritual readiness is now planted on a firm foundation. And if you can understand the society to which you are called to serve, if you can understand the church and the vocations that the church makes available to us, that intellectual readiness solidifies your readiness to serve, because now you can actually see what is needed in both society at large, you might say, but also within the church in terms of your adoption of a vocation, whether it be marriage on the one hand, or priesthood or religious life on the other. So in my mind, intellectual readiness, which is, you might say, what the university or the college offers specifically, is actually the engine behind the readiness of moral readiness, spiritual readiness, and the readiness to serve to which we are called. And by the way, in my own experience as a professor, I see this all the time. The commitment to truth, the love of truth that gets both elicited and begins to get developed and perfected through a liberal education, does something transformative to the soul of young men and women. It gives them the sort of basis whereby they can stand up in the world as morally ready, spiritual ready, and ready to serve. And in my mind, this is what a liberal education offers, both in laying a groundwork for your belonging to a long tradition of learning, a kind of cultivated soul that understands and has been formed both in its imagination and in its intellect to understand the beauty of truth, and then to sort of dig down in a specific major or a specific discipline or subject matter in order to grow in that confidence in what truth is and what it takes, the hard work it takes in order to achieve truth. So when you are thinking about life after high school, I would really encourage you to consider these dimensions of readiness and consider where are the places, what are the programs, what are the curricula that would actually ready me for my service to the world and the great service to the world that God is calling me to. Now, this vision of readiness, this fourfold vision of readiness, is rooted, I would argue, in a certain vision of God and a humble acceptance of his plan for us. And when I thought about how to present that aspect of it, how do we present the providential side of this? This is the readiness side of this. How do we present in that dynamic the providential side of this question and our humble acceptance of this? And when I thought about this, the first person to whom I turned was St. John Henry Newman. St. John Henry Newman, whose motto, as you can see at the bottom of your screen, as his motto as a cardinal was cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. And in some ways, that is what is another way to describe the dynamic of readiness and providence that I am trying to lay out here. A human heart meets the merciful heart of God. And in that lies human greatness. And that that human heart has to be holistically formed in the 4 ways of readiness that I talked about. But on the other hand, we have to have a certain vision of God that's rooted in trust of him and humble acceptance of his plan for us. And in one of his meditations, St. John Henry Newman articulates this so beautifully that I would just like to read it in order to make it alive to you rather than give any sort of attempt to put it in my own words. St. John Henry writes this: God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I never may know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. I shall do good. I shall do his work. I shall be an angel of peace, a preacher of truth in my own place, while not intending it, if I do but keep his commandments and serve him in my calling. Therefore, I will trust him. Whatever, wherever I am, I can never be thrown away. If I am in sickness, my sickness may serve him. In perplexity, my perplexity may serve him. If I am in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. My sickness or perplexity or sorrow may be necessary causes of some great end, which is quite beyond us. He does nothing in vain. He may prolong my life. He may shorten it. He knows what he is about. He may take away my friends. He may throw me among strangers. He may make me feel desolate, make my spirits sink, hide the future from me. Still, he knows what he is about. What a beautiful meditation on divine providence and our place within it, our standing in readiness to serve God no matter what circumstances might befall us. You can see hints of, I don't know if he's thinking about Hamlet at this point, but when he says he does nothing in vain, no sparrow falls without God's knowing. He may prolong my life, he may shorten it. He knows what he is about. And for our part, as Newman seems to be implying here, the readiness is all. We must be ready for that moment, ready morally, ready spiritually, ready to serve, all rooted in some way and strengthened by an intellectual readiness that can see the truth of the situations that we are going to face. Now that's a sort of serious note, you might say, and an important serious note. And maybe some of you are not as familiar with St. John Henry Newman's writings as you may be with Gandalf. And what I want to suggest to you is that something like this same dynamic is at work in Tolkien's understanding of the bringing about of greatness, right? The greatness that befalls characters who seem, from the eyes of the world, perhaps not the fitting ones to be carrying out certain activities. But what is the difference? They are ready. But this is a struggle that each of us faces, right? And we can remember that struggle that Frodo faces when he has to deal with the ring and deal with what he is called to do to destroy it. And there's this beautiful short exchange between Frodo and Gandalf that takes place early in the whole series of The Lord of the Rings, in the Fellowship of the Ring. And this is what Frodo says: I wish it need not have happened in my time. The ring, Mordor, Mount Doom. I wish it need not have happened in my time. We might say that right now about all sorts of things in the world that we might be facing. And what does Gandalf reply? The wise Gandalf says to him, so do I. The compassion, so do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. In order to decide what to do with the time that is given us, in order to decide what to do as you think about your future life and your future vocation, I would argue, on your part, the readiness is all. I encourage you then to undertake your college decision-making and eventually your college career with this dynamic in mind: the fruitful marriage of your human readiness and God's loving and merciful providence. You may find that opportunities for greatness begin to appear all around you in everyday ways, in the everyday work you do in the world as you try to contribute to the common good. But I would argue even more in your future life beyond college, in the vocation that you carry out, especially as a husband or a wife, as a father or a mother, as a priest or a nun or some other religious, or any other particular role to which you feel called by God. Both God and the world await your readiness. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I will now open it up to any comments. I will stop sharing my screen, and if anyone would like to ask questions, I am happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walz. Very enjoyable presentation. We have a couple questions that have come in already, actually, and believe these are from people who are watching on Facebook. So what would you tell a student who is out there sitting at their desk on the verge of having to make a decision, perhaps reluctantly, and they don't know what they should do with their next step?
Very good question. And those are, these are difficult moments, it might seem, to make that, to answer that question and make this decision right now. But I hope that some of what I said in my presentation would be the basis of a more particular answer to that question. I do think that a student should probably focus on two things. On the one hand, and this is maybe a given for almost everything, right? You have to be in a condition of prayer, right? You have to be open to what God wants you to do. That openness is fostered and encouraged by a regular communication with God through prayer, through the sacramental life, through liturgy, through your participation in your church, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of the given envelope within which this decision ought to be made. On the other hand is what I tried to lay out. You want to be thinking about what kind of decision and what kind of result of that decision will prepare me or ready me for the challenges I am likely to face, both in the world as a member of society, as a citizen who needs to be ready to contribute in whatever ways one can, but also in a vocation within the church, within the community of believers to which you are called to live out a particular vocation or state of life. And in particular, I would argue, for most of us, that means marriage, but also, of course, the possibility of God calling you to priesthood or religious life in some form. So what I'd like to encourage students to enter into is this kind of dialogue between their life of prayer that opens them up to sort of a sense of providence, where they will see this decision as taking place within a providential context. But their reason really asking them, what kind of place will ready me in a holistic way for my presence in the world and the carrying out of my vocation? What kind of place, what kind of community is it that will prepare me morally? Is it a community of faith that will prepare me spiritually? Does it offer opportunities for service that will inspire in my soul a desire for the common good? And as I argued, most fundamentally in some ways for the college decision, what kind of curriculum and intellectual life does it offer? Does it provide me a sufficient awareness of the tradition to which I belong that is so easily forgotten in today's world? And does it allow me to drill down in a serious way to arrive at true knowledge and a confidence in the truth that comes from focusing on a discipline? That's a little longer than I thought it would be, but that would be my advice for such a student.
Thank you. And another question more attached to your institution. What makes the University of Dallas unique among other Catholic colleges?
That's a great question. One with which I feel in some ways particularly familiar. I went to a different institution for my undergrad. I went to another Catholic institution for my graduate school. I taught at another Catholic institution for several years. So I feel like I have a fairly good grip on what sets the University of Dallas apart. To try to be brief in that regard would be to say this: the University of Dallas is a university. So it brings to bear all that a university can bring to bear. It has a sort of larger life than you might find in a smaller college where the community is a little bit smaller and maybe not as populated with as many disciplines that bring together a kind of living conversation between undergrads and grad students and etc. So I think that's important to see about the University of Dallas. It really is a university in that full sense. It still retains, however, a residential community that is founded, I would argue, in freedom. The tagline, if you could put it that way, for the University of Dallas is that it is the Catholic University for independent thinkers. And there is a way in which the University of Dallas encourages you to be free, to develop into adulthood in a manner that you take responsibility for, not based so much on rules and regulations, as much as on the rigor of a curriculum that forces you to give attention to your studies in a way that brings order to your life. And in terms of that curriculum, UD is known, of course, for its incredible core curriculum that introduces you to all sorts of disciplines and lays that foundation that I talked about before of a sort of enculturation into Western civilization, a sort of entering into a tradition, both in terms of its literature, history, theology, philosophy, and other disciplines that contribute to a full vision of the human being. And in particular, within that curriculum, the University of Dallas does an incredible job of forming the imagination, really feeding the imagination, which becomes a source for your thinking more philosophically, theologically, for your becoming a great artist, for your entering the work world with a kind of imaginative creativity, for your entrance into political life with an awareness of the various possibilities that stand open imaginatively. So there is a way in which the University of Dallas in particular does a good job of forming what I would call a Catholic imagination that is in some ways trying to be universal in its scope by rooting you in the long tradition of Catholic learning and simultaneously requiring you to enter into a major that will bring a kind of rigor and depth that will allow you to enter the world with a kind of confidence that I am a person who can know things. I am a person who understands what it would take to be wise within a certain context. All of that, of course, takes place, as is sort of par for the course at the University of Dallas, in a Catholic context, a context that encourages students, not by force, but draws out of them a desire to grow closer to God, to grow in faith, hope, and charity, all within a liturgical and sacramental context that allows them to stay connected to the church at large. And I would say allows them to really make good choices about vocation. You see, good marriages can come out of the University of Dallas. You see that vocations can come out of the University of Dallas, vocations in the strict sense of priests and religious. And all of that is because of the seedbed of Catholicism that sort of makes its presence felt at the University of Dallas in a kind of natural way. So that, I hope, gives you some sense of what makes the University of Dallas unique among other Catholic colleges and universities.
Thank you very much. And a more personal question, if you could go back in time, was there a singular moment or series of events that shaped your path? If so, can you elaborate on them?
Yes, that is a personal question. Wow, where to begin? I think of moments, the moments that strike me were, I remember the moments of my own college decision making, and a sort of moment when I committed myself despite all sorts of other options that seemed available to me, to go to my alma mater, which I love, Christendom College, and to commit myself to that place. That to me was a really crucial moment in my life. It was a moment where I committed myself to liberal education of the sort that Christendom offers and a number of other Catholic schools, including the University of Dallas, offers. And that became, for me, that commitment, a sort of transformative moment. And it required, having to really focus in on what do I want ultimately, even if there are other options available to me. For me, it was a moment that kind of brought to the forefront of my mind the importance of the faith in my life and its centrality in understanding the kind of education that I wanted. Other moments that strike me that maybe even are more personal have to do with the sort of happy circumstances and sometimes fortunate circumstances that brought my wife and me together, that bore fruit, such as the, the young man on your screen. Ultimately, those were moments of both decision, but also providential guidance, where God's plan becomes clear to you over time. I also would add, and Nicholas could maybe join me in this, is the moment in which my wife gave birth to our 7th child, who has Down syndrome. And it was sort of a moment of decision to accept God's providence in our lives and to welcome it in ways that, as I said, Nicholas can probably attest as well as I, that have borne incredible fruit for our family. So in some ways, the family decisions, the educational decisions, were moments where I saw this dynamic of my having to really deliberate and think through a question that was met by a kind of providential hand that was subtly nudging me in various directions. And hopefully my heart has been open to following God's will in those moments. And if I might add, just as a last thing, the decisions that I made as a professor in terms of moving from this institution or that, or choosing this or that, this also shows up in the work world. I think in some ways it's more important at the level of vocation, but work too is a vocation in the world to which we respond. And I've always had a sense of my own deliberation coming into contact with divine providence that at this moment of my life has brought me to the University of Dallas. So that's a great question, and I hope I answered it with enough precision.
No, thank you very much. There's 2 questions that are more technical about admissions aspects of the University of Dallas. So how proactive is UD in helping students with finding scholarships and grants? And does UD accept the CLT, since taking the ACT or SAT has been impacted a lot by the pandemic?
Yeah, and of course, I'm not the primary point person on these questions, but I do know enough to at least get started on an answer. UD is, in my mind, extremely generous when it comes to financial aid and scholarship opportunities. And I would argue, especially with our new president, Dr. Thomas Hibbs, getting more generous by the day. More more donors are seeing the uniqueness of UD, giving money to the endowment that can be used for scholarships for students. So as I said, I'm not the point person on that. You would want to turn to those in admissions or financial aid departments to answer that. But generally speaking, UD wants those who are willing and able to undertake the kind of rigorous liberal education, and UD will do what it takes to make that happen if there is seen to be a good complementarity between the student and the institution. And the second question, the CLT is definitely accepted by UD. UD, I think, has been on the forefront of that to some degree, along with several other institutions that not only realize some of the more practical difficulties of the SAT and the ACT, which, you know, serve their purpose as being measures of intelligence and possible prognosticators of success in college, but also the CLT, which in some ways bespeaks a kind of education that might prepare you in a particular way for the Catholic liberal education that UD offers in a residential community informed by faith. So the CLT is welcome at UD, and I would encourage those of you who want to go that route to feel free to do so. And again, I would talk to admissions about how admissions evaluates the CLT. Those details are not, I'm not privy to at this time, but I know that UD is very open to that test because of what it bespeaks about the sort of education a student would be coming with to UD. Great question.
So I believe those are all the questions we've had so far, both in the Q&A and from Facebook. I think a lot of people have appreciated your talk. One person comments, thank you very much. Listening to you is really providential.
Good. I would hesitate to call myself an instrument of God, although I guess all of us are in some ways. But I do hope that some of these words that I said bring you to a kind of confidence in making this decision, a confidence that can be rooted in faith, but also in your own sense of self and your own sense of what you want out of the college decision ultimately. And to always remember that the human greatness to which God is calling each one of us is always the fruit of that human divine dynamic of our own readiness and divine providence. So if I played some small role in that, I can only offer the glory to God himself.
I do think we did just get another question concerning UD. I think an important question for the university. What is the relationship like between students and the faculty?
I am so glad that you asked this question, because this is something that almost I take for granted, but should have been answered when someone asked me about what's distinctive about UD. UD is a university, as I said. And what that can often mean at a lot of places, and I don't want to start bad-mouthing any places in particular, but what that can kind of mean is that the professors are more taken up in their modes of research and writing and publication. UD is this unique university, which has all the greatness of a university, coupled with very close and customized, as it were, student-professor relationships. Or another way to put that, at the heart of the University of Dallas lies the teaching of the professor and the learning of the student, and the personal interaction and exchange between professor and student. And this is true from the faculty side. This is true in terms of what we prioritize as faculty. Teaching comes first for me and my colleagues. Does that mean it might come at the cost of research? I don't think I would put it that way. Our research in some ways is the fruit of teaching, and in some ways makes our research more real to us and filters back into what we are able to teach. So research is an important dimension, but it's not the priority at UD. I will attest from my own personal experience just how well I get to know the students in my classes. Right now, for instance, I'm teaching a senior seminar with 15 students in it, and we're working together to talk about this philosophic topic. The topic happens to be friendship this year. And I'm working one-on-one with each of them, trying to come up with a senior thesis, trying to engage them in producing a beautiful product at the end of their education that bespeaks all that has come out of their engagement with our curriculum. Yesterday, for instance, and I could say this about pretty much every day last week, I met for an hour and a half with a student to really talk through the process of how to arrive at a thesis, how to arrive at the kind of research that will be required. And you end those conversations feeling like what marks the University of Dallas is a friendship between professor and student, an appropriate friendship that sort of respects that relationship, but allows a kind of appropriate exchange take place where there's a realization that the truth that we want to share really matters to both of us. It's not just a scholarly enterprise, but the truth really matters to us. Why? Because it's brought into that ambit of moral readiness, spiritual readiness, and service to the world and to the church that the University of Dallas exists for. So when the truth is sought with that mission in mind, to be a contributor to the problematic world in which we live, which is a part of the mission of the University of Dallas, it seems to me that the professor-student relationship becomes very much at the core of the enterprise that the University of Dallas is about. Great question, and I'm glad I was able to sort of refine my answer about what is truly distinctive about the University of Dallas.
Well, I believe that's all the questions we have for today, but thank you so much for your beautiful talk. I think a lot of people appreciated it.
Thank you, and thank you, Nicholas, for getting up early and helping your father by hosting this with me. And I thank everyone who themselves got up early to watch this presentation, and anyone who might be watching it in a recorded fashion. I appreciate your taking the time to do so, considering what I had to say, and considering the University of Dallas as a possible place, a providential place for you to carry out your next stage of your life. So thank you all, and I appreciate all that you did to listen and to be here today.